private creditors, 30% is multilateral, and 30% is bilateral. And depending on which creditor we're looking at, we're having very different challenges, and it's important to recognize that. And this was sort of alluded to in previous discussions yesterday, but I want to touch upon 2 points that in many ways contribute to the challenges that we see today. And first is the role of credit rating agencies. So when African countries take out commercial loans, as we all know, African countries continue to have very low ratings, which creates the illusion that investing in African countries is very high risk, which leads to very high interest rates. And that makes borrowing very costly and raises the cost of capital extremely for African countries, which in many ways also limits the financing that we'll be able to have in different sectors. And we've also had conversations around, for instance, the establishment of an African credit rating agency, which was also mentioned in some of the discussions yesterday. But it also, in many ways, raises the point, why haven't we created one so far? We see the impact that it's had of not having our own credit rating agency. And so sometimes it's also important to sort of reflect and see our own internal weaknesses in ensuring that we sort of remedy some of the issues that we're seeing. And second is the point on debt sustainability analysis, which is conducted by the World Bank and the IMF, which ranks countries as low, moderate, high, or in risk of debt distress. And this creates what is known as an African risk premium. And with this, it creates this illusion, similar to with credit rating agencies, that investing in African countries is extremely risky. And just to put this into perspective, so there was a study that was done in 2015, and it showed that African countries, the interest rate that African countries were paying for bonds was 2.9% higher than the rest of the world. And so when we see numbers like this, we really see the role that these different sort of mechanisms play in terms of allowing African countries access to concessional financing. And I just want to quickly mention about an infrastructure financing report that we do at Development Reimagined. And we use an economic metric model that looks at infrastructure investment that is needed in different African countries from the periods of 2022 to 2030. And our first report looked at countries that are part of the G20 Common Framework, so Ethiopia, Chad, Zambia. And just to give you an example of the scale of financing that is needed in some of these countries, and I'll use Ethiopia as an example, just for water infrastructure financing, Ethiopia needs between 1.6 and 3 billion USD, which is a massive amount for just one relatively small sector. And to meet the SDGs between 2021 to 2030, Ethiopia will need between 235 and 348 billion USD to meet the SDGs. Now that is a massive amount, and we are surely not going to get that without taking out lots of debt, right? And so when we do that, though, it's important that when we take out that debt, are we putting it into productive assets? Are we investing it in infrastructure and in sectors that are able to, in many ways, put that positive return into our economies, and making sure that when we do borrow, that we borrow very consciously as well. And so this is in many ways the problems that we're facing. But in terms of the solution, and I'll touch upon just two things. And I really want to praise the African Legal Support Facility, because they are doing some really great work in terms of supporting African governments when it comes to their contracts with different creditors. And so I think supporting African financial institutions that have already in many ways started this work is very, very important. And the second point I want to touch upon is the Borrowers Club. And this is a concept that at Development Reimagined we have been promoting and pushing for a very long time. And I know we discussed this in a panel at the end of yesterday's session. And the Borrowers Club, I think, in many ways solves a lot of issues. And just in a nutshell, to explain what the Borrowers Club is. So the Borrowers Club is essentially a club of borrowers where countries club together to secure fresh financing and using each other's growth prospects to be able to secure cheap concessional financing from different creditors. And one of the benefits of the Borrowers Club is the aspect of information sharing. Each African country has a wealth of information with the different contracts that they have with different creditors. And just that information sharing in itself will ensure that different countries can, when they go and speak to creditors, have all this information that they can use then to ensure that they have an upper hand in many ways. And sometimes something as simple as communication really goes a long way. And we can even have, for instance, MDBs that can include Borrowers Club. And that's something that we're definitely trying to push for. And so I think there's two really important things. I think there is, and Magdalene touched a little bit about this in terms of the reform of the international financial architecture, and we're in many different conversations around that. I think a reform of current existing mechanisms that we have seen time and time again does not continue to work for Africans and does not prioritize our needs and our interests, and also just more innovation. And the Borrowers Club, I think, can really help us go a long way in terms of meeting the SDGs, Agenda 2063, and really putting African voices and African agency at the forefront. I think, in general, more finance really without reform is not sufficient, and challenges are not tackled because of global coordination failures. It's not funds, really. So in many ways, existing funding reinforces a lot of those inequalities. So I know this is quite a lot, but at DR, I think this is really what we try to promote and how we ensure that we can become a rule maker and not a rule taker in many ways.
Thank you very much, Etse. Dr. Ohio, let me come to you. Can we delve more into the legal contracts themselves, the clauses that we've been talking about, the pari passu, the force majeure, even the dispute resolution clauses, in which jurisdiction, using which law?
Thank you, Samantha. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back here with Afrodad. And thank you, Dr. Magali, for a wonderful presentation and for the excellent research you're doing. Your research is quite ambitious, but it's also much needed and also very timely. When you were speaking, I just remember there was a story of some controversy about a clause in a Chinese loan contract with the Nigerian government. And so the lawmakers were grilling the then Minister of Transport, Rotimi Amechi, about this particular clause. And it caused a lot of controversy because it appeared that the Nigerian officials were not very clear on the implications of certain clauses that were included, which related to whether or not Nigeria was actually getting involved in a infrastructure transaction that potentially was signing off Nigeria's sovereignty. I remember when it actually made the news, a lot of the public were really, there was a lot of social media reports on this as to, and there were misconceptions as well about the full implications of the agreement and the clauses contained in this agreement that the Nigerian government had signed onto. So to reiterate what Magali has mentioned, contracts are the very foundation of these relationships that relate to sovereign debt and transactions between sovereigns and creditors, irrespective of the type of creditors we're looking at. And Samantha, as you mentioned, yes, the clauses in question are critical to shaping the rights and obligations of the parties involved. And there's been lots of controversies about the interpretations of some of these clauses, such as pari passu clauses. And it got me thinking when Magali was presenting about whether or not the envisaged project is focusing on developing a standard template contract or is trying to develop a more of a repertoire of approaches which are relevant and African-centered. Maybe something kind of similar to what we've seen with the Pan-African Investment Code in the area of investment, whereby we have templates or models which are more suited to addressing, some of the issues that are of pertinent interest to Africa. So in terms of the contract clauses, these clauses they've been there for a long time. A number of them were not originally applicable in sovereign debt contracts, but have found their way in to this type of agreement. And this is an important point because, as I mentioned earlier on, I think there needs to be a clear distinction between developing a standard agreement or contract as against developing an approach to a contractual approach that is African-centered. And I believe that the latter will be more beneficial than the former. And I say this because, as Dr. Magali mentioned, which is also very instructive, we've seen a significant change in the creditor landscape and the interactions between creditors and sovereigns over the years. We've also seen the rapid erosion or erosion of state immunity and the vulnerabilities of our governments to disagreements and the clauses in contained therein. So in essence, it's important that the work that Magali is doing focuses more on developing an African-centered approach to the drafting and of these clauses, also in helping or aiding African governments during negotiations or for these loans to ensure that the clauses are interpreted in a way that are not disfavorable to the African government. And if that is going to be the case, another important question that needs to be answered then is, and Dr. Magali has given us the why. So we are very clear about why this is important. Dr. Magali was very clear to emphasize that this is just one of the points or areas where intervention is required. So she's explained the why. She's also done a wonderful, brilliant job also giving us, teasing out what this should look like. Obviously, drawing back on what I mentioned earlier on, that there should be more focus on approach rather than a specific singular agreement, because we're in a very fluid scenario. The scenarios are very fluid. Things are fast changing, and so we need to be flexible and adaptable. And so having a repertoire or a toolkit of solutions or clauses which are African-centered will be more beneficial in being able to respond as things change. So we understand the why and the what, but I think that another area that needs emphasis would be the who. Who or where would we develop this? Where would we house this? Who would be responsible for driving this initiative? Where would it sit? And I know Dr. Magali has the answer because she has done some excellent work on this with regard to some suggestions she's made in some work I've read that she's done about an African Sovereign Debt Forum. And I know my colleague from Palu is here, so this is not to be confused with the African Legal Support Facility, which we have with the AFDB. So in essence, in trying to identify who will be responsible for driving this, we need to first and foremost look at what already exists within the landscape in terms of the approaches and proposals and existing support mechanisms for drafting and interpretation of these clauses, as well as during the time of debt contracting, as well as during restructuring. And then once we identify, or in this particular project, when Dr. Magali is able to identify the gaps, then it then gives or creates a proper foundation to then find ways to provide something which does not reinvent the wheel, but supports and complements already existing mechanisms and facilities and support institutions which provide support already on the African continent. So I think that will be a very important way to approach or to design this African-centered approach in terms of the contractual clauses that will be important in framing Africa's position in relation to debt contracting moving forward. So in essence, in summary, what I'm saying is that the clauses themselves per se do not necessarily, if we emphasize so much on the clauses such as collective action clauses, as Magali mentioned, a lot of this innovation with respect to clauses have come from market players. And in many ways, yes, the market in a capitalist-driven framework, the market is given a lot of leeway to produce or to innovate in this regard. But as it is evident, as I mentioned earlier on with the Pan-African Investment Code in the area of investment protection, there is a need for institutional intervention, which is regional or continental, which provides a kind of loose framework, provides a toolkit of possible or potential clauses which are interpreted in a way that best serve Africa's purposes. That would be a good way to drive the work or move the work forward. Other than that, in terms of next steps, this is really exciting, and I really look forward to seeing what Dr. Magali and her team produce. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ohio. Thank you very much. Now, Nona, let's try and be realistic and talk about the real-life issues that we're dealing with in as far as the debt discourse is concerned. We're looking at debt restructuring, and we know there are a number of comments that the common framework is neither common nor is it even a framework. And perhaps it's because there's no legal framework to govern that kind of debt restructuring. We know you've worked extensively on issues to do with Chad and Zambia. Can you share some examples and some lessons that you think we can draw from the debt restructuring process that have happened in those countries and their austerity measures? Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Magali. I think it was a really great presentation. And also to my co-panelists, whom I'm going to borrow from. So before I get to the examples, Samantha, just to raise a few issues. Yes, I agree completely with Magali when she says we do need to have a collective standardized approach, and Dr. Ohio has just suggested having a contractual approach, and I think I sit right in the middle and suggest to keep both options. Why? First, the beauty about having a contractual approach, like Dr. Ohio has mentioned, is the flexibility to be able to make changes as times evolve. But when you think about the standardized contract, I think there are two key advantages with that. Number one, like both Dr. Ohio and Dr. Magali mentioned, is there's an unequal bargaining power that we all recognize between creditors and debtors. And I remember when I was attending grad school, one of my professors always used to say, how do you put officials from the government of Togo in a room with officials from China? First of all, the contract is probably going to be negotiated in a boardroom in China. So how when you think about that and the bargaining power, do we then see more value in having a sort of standardized approach that has been, a standardized contract that has been agreed upon on the continent, right? That's one. But then also with market players leading. And a key example, this is beyond the collective action clauses, is we now have the natural disaster clauses. And it's a good innovation. It's something African countries should be taking into consideration for climate, especially. But private actors have already jumped onto it. As we speak, they've come up with the private sector working group that was appointed by the UK Treasury, along with the International Capital Markets Association, have come up with a draft clause of a natural disaster clause. So by the time we get to it, they're just a step forward all the time. So it is very important that we, as a continent, take leadership of some of these things and come up with a unified position. And I agree we can keep making changes to the clauses as they come. Same thing happened with collective action clauses. You know, we had the double limb, and then we have the single limb, and, you know, we keep making the changes, but there's value in having a standardized contract and a position as African countries. So to then go to the next point, which is what are some of the advantages about the discussion we're having, you know, looking more into the contractual approach. I think the very first one, if you look at the example of Zambia, for instance, is Zambia has just negotiated with its official creditors. They have a deal and are now going to discuss with commercial creditors. And we know that they had a euro bond that was maturing in 2022, another in 2024. And as far as I know, I stand to be corrected, those don't have collective action clauses. And so there is a possibility of having vulture fund litigation, vulture fund action around that. I know the much later euro bond, I think the one that's due in 2027 has collection action clauses, but then if we were having this discussion in 2013, for instance, right? This is something, if we had collective action clauses in those contracts by this time, we'd be having a completely different discussion now. You know, so this is some of the values that we see in having some of these clauses that Dr. Magali just presented. Another example is Chad. Chad is one of the most climate vulnerable countries on the continent, but also one of the most indebted countries. And it also just completed a debt restructuring. I think the deal came out late last year, early this year. And it was a very disappointing deal, very disappointing. Even the World Bank itself came out and said, you know, this how is there no debt relief, no debt restructuring, right? But then again, if we did have natural disaster clauses that had been implemented, you know, that had been in these contracts beforehand, a country like Chad would then benefit, for instance, when we have a natural disaster, a climate disaster, by having that kind of buffer, that protection when you have a crisis. So that just serves to show the value of having some of these clauses. So when we think about the opportunities, I was sad to see Dr. Patrick from African Union walk out because I wanted to say, hold on, I think I have something to mention. But I think the African Union definitely, when we're discussing the who, have a really, really big role to play in this. And I'll give an example with the EU. So the EU in the European Council agreed that they would have collective action clauses in all their bonds. From like 2010, it was agreed that from now all countries will have collective action clauses. And I think these are some of the positions that even African Union needs to be pushing for African countries to agree on continent-wide. And also an opportunity stands for them to design some of these debt standstills, natural disaster clauses, hurricane clauses, name it. I think there really is a huge opportunity for leadership by the African Union. And we can have a discussion here, but if we don't have ownership at a continent level, you know, because another key question for Dr. Magali is how do we then have buy-in for this standardized contract that we have developed? And so having the stamp of the African Union, some of these institutions where we have leadership of our countries involved would be very, very key. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nona. Now, Ranga, we're here to, you know, rethink and reimagine debt contracts, and you're coming from the Pan-African Lawyers Union. What do you think are some of the things that we need to be alert to when we're then to come up with a standardized debt contract agreement? And what do you think is the role of lawyers in all of these discussions where previously we may have had economists and politicians coming into the discussion? Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Samantha, and thanks to Dr. Magali for your well-researched paper and a wonderful presentation, and also thanks to my fellow panelists. So to begin with, as much as we are talking about model loan contraction, we need not to speak of issues on debt in isolation to the broader fabric of domestic resource mobilization. We have tax agreements, mining agreements, investments agreements. We need to be alive to all those agreements. It's also important to mention that as Pan-African Lawyers Union, our conference for this year focused on debt management, and some of the things that I'm going to talk about, it's a distillation of the broader conversations that we held in Livingstone. So before we delve into the specific issues that should be included in the model loan contract, it's important to highlight that most of the contracts that our governments are signing are not working in favor of African countries. A closer look at these contracts, you will see that the imprints of neocolonialism, the imprints of capitalism are reflected in those contracts. When we talk about model loan agreements, there are some things, specific things, that are important, and one of those things is the issue of human rights. When we talk of human rights, the first point of call is the African Charter on Human Rights, the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and also the report by the independent expert on debt and human rights. So some of the things that we need to pay attention to, they include issues on fiscal consolidation. We all know the implications of this, that they reduce government expenditure and subsidies, especially on social sectors that play a pivotal role in equalizing poverty and inequality. We also need to pay special attention to the structural reforms, as some of these prioritize debt repayments at the expense of social expenditure. We also need to look at issues of privatization, deregulation of the financial labor markets, which foster economic dependence and undermine the public control of vital resources. We also need to consider the terms of payments. Usually, longer grace periods are important as they give countries time to mobilize resources and also try to balance debt repayments and service provision. Another point is also the issue of debt restructuring. So whatever mechanisms, processes that countries are going to engage in, these processes, they also need to be sensitive to human rights issues. And the UN independent expert has done a publication on human rights issues when it comes to debt restructuring. Then Samantha also wants to touch on the issue of force majeure. Yeah, I think it's important to have these clauses in the loan contract. So generally speaking, there are three main things that need to be considered when you talk of force majeure. The first one is that the events, they must be unforeseeable, they must be external to the parties of the contract, and they must be unavailable. So why is it important to have these clauses? So the current contracts, they are skewed and they protect the interests of the lenders, and they shift a lot of risks to debtor countries. So using the COVID-19 pandemic as an example, we have seen that nobody predicted that COVID was coming, and it was unavoidable. And when it comes to debt, the mechanisms that were there, they did not work for the African countries. Talk of the G20 Common Framework, the DSSI. Still, countries, they have to pay their loans regardless of this COVID-19. Hence, it is really important that we consider issues of force majeure. So, how should this clause look like? The first thing is to determine whether we really need to include force majeure. And from what I've just said and what my colleagues have said, we can see that it's important that we include this clause in the contracts. The devil is in the details, so they say. The next step will now be to carefully consider the language that we use in this clause, like it has to be explicit. And then lastly, we have to have like a clear description of these events so that we avoid unnecessary conflict. Then on the role of lawyers, lawyers, they play a very important role when it comes to issue of debt management. So in this process of coming up with a model contract, it's important that lawyers ensure that this contract is harmonized and it conforms to the elements and issues of human rights. And this contract should be flexible and customizable to ensure that it takes into account the specificities of different countries. Lawyers should also ensure that the terms of the agreements are acceptable and are within the confines of national constitutions and legal frameworks. To make this more impactful, it's important that lawyers push for sound debt management policies at the national level. And already we have the Aphrodite Borrowing Charter, which sets a stronger foundation for understanding how the legal frameworks for debt management should look like. And this partly addressed the challenge on a comprehensive legal framework that has been mentioned by Dr. Magali. Lawyers should also ensure that there is a balance of obligations between the debtor countries and the creditors. Lawyers should also be propositional rather than problematizing issues. Yeah. Then I just want to touch on the issues that have been raised by Dr. Ohio and Nona. So who will do this? So to partly answer that question, the Stop the Bleeding campaign, we are going to launch a project on the Africa debt. So part of the things that we want to do is to actually draft a model contract. So this process is going to be inclusive, and all the actors, players, stakeholders who are working on issues of debt management, they are going to be included in that project. In terms of getting the buy-in, we work with different technical committees of the African Union. So once we have this model loan contract, the next step is then to have some discussions with the technical committees, and then we identify institutions within the AU that can then push this model contract to the Commission and then to the presidents. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ranga. Thank you very much to all our panelists for sharing with us their insights. I think what is coming out so very clearly is that we are in a situation where Africa has got some unequal bargaining power, and so just getting to the table and talking about these clauses may actually be difficult. And I think that is why we had the first day of this conference talking about the political and economic analysis of things, to ask ourselves, how do we even get to the table? Have you also even looked inwardly to check if we are already, in line with our domestic laws? But however, for today, we're talking about, we're rethinking and reimagining what the debt contracts could look like if we had such bargaining power, and I think that is very important. I think we would like now to extend this time to the audience. We really would love to hear your thoughts, your insights, if you have some questions. We should have a roving mic. Yes. So we have two here, we have one, and another one in the middle. Thank you very much. We have those four.
Thank you very much. Zulu Ishmael is my name from the Tax Justice Network. Thank you so much for the presentations and the comments from the panelists. They've been very, very insightful. And for me, whilst you're speaking, I'm just trying to marry the conversations of the political economy of debt and the legal framework around debt. So I'm not sure who is best placed to respond to this, but how do you ensure that African countries that are in high levels of debt distress, those that require the resources, are taking cognizance or are taking into account legal framework around debt? So I'll give a specific example. As a disclaimer, I come from Zambia, and it has been one of the countries that has experienced high levels of debt distress. So how do you ensure that a government that is trying to make sure that it is providing for its citizens, is trying to make sure that it is food secure, is trying to make sure that it is able to provide for healthcare and whatnot, and is trying to organize for money, be it through borrowing, and you're telling them that you have to make sure that you have these model laws, you have to make sure that these are negotiated in your contracts. There's also the political dynamics in terms of negotiation. How do you ensure that you get what is best for you as a country in terms of negotiations on the table, and not just taking rules from the people that are giving you the money? So marrying the conversations on the political economy and the legal framework. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you very much. We can have the next question.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Thank you, dear panelists, and thank you, Dr. Magali. Mine will not be a question. Actually, I want to bring some comments from what I heard because it was quite interesting. Dr. Magali gave us a very interesting aspect of what we need to know on debt contracting. But when she finished her presentation, I was quite worried before the panelists came in to start getting some nuance. And the one that I like the most is that we need to distinguish between having an approach and looking at a model contract, which is for me a little bit dangerous, because when you modelize and then you lose flexibility, and you can't deal with the differences that we have among countries. We just heard our friend from Zambia giving an example. So I think, and I want to be with you, Dr. Oyo and Nano, I think we rather need to try to find out what is the approach that we are going to have when we get to our contract, when we do contracting, debt contracting in Africa. And the result of what that approach should be a specific guideline, a baseline for us to follow when we get into contracting, into debt contracting. So that's where we also stand in between the approach and the contracting. Because if you have clauses today and tomorrow the environment changes, you are in trouble. So we need to be flexible enough and get a baseline that is, let us look for the kind of structure that we should have in our debt contracting in such a way that a country would look at that baseline and adapt its contracting to the situation in the country. It also helps us know how to bring the differences in the way we use our bargaining power. But now, regarding the bargaining power, I will bring this conversation to what we discussed yesterday. You can't have any bargaining power if you keep your room as dirty as it is today in Africa. We need to sweep the place well before we can claim a bargaining power, because the bargaining power is about what? It's about what you can sell. What can we sell in terms of debt in Africa? What we can sell is our wealth. We do have the wealth, which is enough for us to put on the market and bargain for financing. And this is what we seem to I mean, when we go out there, we forget that. We forget that we are the rich. They are not the rich. They can just provide money for us today, we have the money for tomorrow. That's why we are getting into borrowing. So I will conclude by saying that the way we should take, and I'm addressing Dr. Magali, whom I know well, what we should address today is how we step from what AFRODAT did in initiating the borrowing charter to another step, because the borrowing charter is political. Let us step to the step where we have a technical guideline, which will be like a debt contracting guideline for Africa, which takes into account the needs of Africa and the situation in which Africa wants to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
I am Martin Sunke from Africa Development Interchange Network. I live in Cameroon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful comments. They're really appreciated, and we've taken note. We had one hand in the middle. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Diana Gishengo from Kenya. I work at the Institute for Social Accountability. Thank you very much. A very important conversation on debt contracts as just contracts. But can they really be just contracts? My apologies. We had a discussion in Kenya, and the discussion was when any creditor contracts debt with a state, can the same standards of the law of contract apply when you're binding an entire population? And today we've focused on certain clauses, but as we move to the era of debt relief, odious debt, and so on, as Africa, there is Gabon, probably the new government will say all the debt that was contracted should be subjugated, because it wasn't validly, it was to suppress all the people of Gabon, validly so. What do we do about such contracts? And that's just the extreme. In my own country, debt is misappropriated and is used for campaign. It is used to enrich the people who must vie and become political leaders in the next election. Do we still apply the same clauses of contracting? And the creditors understand what they are doing, and they collude and connive with government, then the ordinary person continues to suffer. When we, the people of Africa, decide this is not our debt, do we still apply the law of contract?
Thank you very much, Diana, for that interesting question. Odious death. Yes, we'll have the last two questions, and then we have the panel respond.
Thank you very much. My name is Anthony Buluma from Kenya. I head the Kenya Young Parliamentarians Association. Just to commend the panel and the contribution by the doctor. Was it doctor or professor? I just wanted to hear you out on specifically the whole notion around just building on what she has talked about. There has been allegations that some of the creditors are buying their way into giving debt facilities to countries, especially African countries. So they come in through the back door in the form of a consultant, who's facilitating the transaction between the specific country and these creditors, so as to bribe their way into, giving that debt. So what is the contractual status in such an arrangement? Because I don't want to mention the specific country, but it is one of the very most prominent within the African space, whereby they have been buying their way into countries in form of debt. then I think also what is the way out when we find ourselves in such a situation? Because I think these conversations are centered just around those of us who are actively engaged today. What about the next generation? How are we preparing them? Considering that a lot of the debt that we are procuring today, most likely is not many of us who will pay, but the children who are being born, the children who are currently in low levels of education. What is their place in all this conversation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have another one, the last one from this row.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Antonio Namburet, a Member of Parliament from Mozambique and the Vice President of the African Parliamentarian Networks Against Corruption. My question is related to the clauses that in most debt contracts we found, the clause of confidentiality, which brings a problem to the transparency that is required for accountability. And we find this mostly in the Chinese contracts to the African governments, where they bar borrowers from revealing the terms of the contract of the debts, or even the existence of the debts itself. And they prefer collaterals in their contracts, and they take advantage over the other creditors. And even in the contracts where they demand that promises be made that the contracts will not enter into collective agreements. It will be done between just China and the African government. So to you, to Dr. Magali and panelists, how can we ensure accountability while we also retain clauses of confidentiality in the contracts? And this is very critical for Africa, and I'm talking specifically about China, which is the biggest creditor in Africa, or at least is getting to that level. And this is crucial for us as parliamentarians, because governments deny access to such contracts based on these confidentiality clauses, which makes it difficult for those who have to play the role of oversight if they have no information about those contracts. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, and thank you to everyone for their questions that they posed to the panel. We really appreciate it. I'll ask the panel to respond. Okay, so let's have Dr. Magali first, and then we have the panel come in last. Dr. Magali, can you hear us?
Questions
Okay.
posed. But I'll try and give a few thoughts on each of them. But first, I'll thank my fellow panelists for the interesting feedback, and it's given me a lot of food for thought. This is indeed a very complex issue. When Aphrodite first approached me to conduct this research, it was very daunting, almost intimidating. But what today's discussion shows is that this is one little drop in a bigger discourse that needs to happen, and that there's a role that we can all play in providing very unique perspectives. So going on to the questions, I think the first question from the colleague in Zambia, he spoke about more of like a political economy perspective, which is like how do we really have equal bargaining power in negotiations, and also mentioned how do we incorporate all, the consideration of these complex contractual issues when you have countries like Zambia that are already grappling with so many concerns. So I think sovereign debt will always be an important component of the development of any country. And I think that there's an important role that national stakeholders need to play to ensure accountability. And these players already have that mandate. So whether or not Zambia is in debt distress, facing health issues, or facing an environmental crisis, there's still a role that, for example, the parliament needs to play, and there's still a role that the office of the Attorney General, as the office that should normally provide a legal oversight over any agreement that the government signs should play. So I think that we already have institutions that are supposed to play the important role of due diligence. And those institutions need to step up. On the second comment, and a very good comment that I do acknowledge, but I have mixed feelings about it, which is from the colleague from Cameroon, which is on the issue of flexibility. And this is, I think, a discussion that I've had with the Aphrodite team. Samantha, you're very aware of some of the interesting discourse we've had on whether or not you need to have a standardized agreement, whether or not you need to have an approach. And I think what's interesting is the fact that at the end of the day, although the idea of a model contract raises questions of flexibility, technically speaking, that is how the industry works. So when we look at the bond markets, for example, there are standardized clauses. So when it comes to the creditor side, they have a standard approach. So you have the International Capital Markets Association that represents the views of commercial creditors, and they come together and come up with actual clauses. You also have, I think, the Loan Market Association and other Europe-based, or mostly London-based organizations that state what the market's perceived clauses should look like. And if you look at the legal literature itself, academics are saying that reforming sovereign debt contracts is complex because they're sticky. They're very difficult to reform. And so in a way, what we're saying is there is already, technically speaking, a standardized approach, but it doesn't come from an African perspective. So I think I have mixed views on whether listening to the comments, do we need a standard contract or do we need an approach? And I'll probably go with Nona's approach that I think we need both. We definitely do need a general approach, but if the markets come to you with standardized clauses, I think it's also important, especially to balance out negotiating bargaining power, to also have assess clauses and have innovations that come from an African perspective. So it's a very tricky and complex one. To the comment from Diana, so she mentioned that can we really say that debt is just a contract when it binds populations? And I think that's such an important statement. When I did my PhD thesis at the University of Pretoria, my big question, or my big premise of my research was that sovereign debt is more than a contract. You need to take a broader perspective. You need to have a human rights approach. You need to take into account environmental concerns. And this was before the COVID-19 pandemic. And I felt that I was standing alone, and I faced a lot of criticism, especially from international scholars. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the perspective on the impacts that sovereign debt can have. However, there are different classes of creditors. So you have your official bilateral creditors and multilateral creditors. And I think it's easier to engage with them and bring in human rights issues. It's easier even for civil society organizations to push for debt relief. But when it comes to privately held debt, it's complicated because technically speaking, what the government has done is they have relinquished sovereign immunity. So the state has said that we are almost like a private individual who is entering into a contract with a bondholder that could literally be me, for example, and that we are relinquishing parts of our sovereign immunity and, for example, will subject ourselves to the laws of New York and will go to the District Court of New York where there's an issue. So the law of contract will still apply when it comes to this to privately held debt. These are private, technically speaking, these are private agreements, but they're private agreements which raise major issues and that really do affect populations. And I think that's why we really need to look at them and see what do they say? What are we contracting or signing to? So it's a very complex. It's a complex one. I don't really like saying it because I'm a believer in an African approach to looking at sovereign debt, which is really looking at it as a broader and even a human rights issue, but from a technical perspective, you would apply the law of contract. Whether or not creditors can enforce these agreements is now the question. And finally, on the last comment by Mr. Anthony from Kenya, so he, I think maybe there are two more comments. So if I understood correctly, you've mentioned the fact that there's some creditors that are kind of buying their way, or there seems to be some corruption when it comes to contractual, sovereign contracts. And I think here really, it's going back to the question of accountability and the role that Parliament needs to play, and bodies that support Parliament, for example, the Office of the Attorney General and so forth, need to play when it comes to accountability. And I think looking at the issues on contracts is more than just looking at the written letter of a contract. It's also looking at the role that these institutions that are supposed to negotiate and sign these contracts and even enforce implement these contracts nationally need to play. And finally, my final thoughts on the issue of confidentiality is that I think we need to take a different perspective when it comes to sovereign debt contracts and other contracts that might be, for example, infrastructure agreements. I personally don't see a need for any confidentiality, and maybe this is controversial, I'm not sure, but I don't see a major need for confidentiality when it comes to the sovereign debt that a country is signing onto. I think that there should be transparency requirements within national laws and also transparency requirements within agreements. I think that these agreements should be published in full. They should be published in a timely manner as soon as possible. And even there should be the negotiation process should not be a secret. And I think that that's the only way that citizens can hold their governments accountable. I don't want to comment much on other contracts that might be, for example, infrastructure contracts, like, for example, public-private partnerships that might have information that is sensitive to a particular investor and might, for example, harm its competition. I think those kinds of agreements are different. But when it comes to sovereign debt, there has to be accountability, because then how do we test debt sustainability if we don't know what has been contracted? So these are my thoughts, and I'll be happy to continue to discuss with the panelists and colleagues over email, over Zoom, or if we find ourselves in the same country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Magali. Really appreciate it. Any last words from our panelists? No? Yes. Wonderful.
Okay, I'm just going to make 3 points. The first one, in law, there's a concept called pacta sunt servanda. So this concept simply means that contracts are binding, and parties to that contract, they have to honor their obligations. I understand that we do have odious debts, but those contracts of odious debts, they are binding. But however, there are avenues to redress these contracts. For example, we have the Africa Legal Support Facility. It was created to deal with some of these unfair contracts. At the national level, we have seen that some of these deals that countries are contracting, they are unconstitutional. We have strategies like litigation. The case of Mozambique, for example, the civic society, the media, they took the government to court when the Mozambican government contracted secretive loans that are dubbed the tuna loans. And we need to have strong debt management laws, frameworks, and policies. And citizens need to understand these laws so that they are in a position to highlight, when the government violate these laws and frameworks. We need to have contract disclosure. These loans are contracted, in the name of the citizens. It is the citizens that are going to repay these loans, so they deserve to know the contracts that the governments are entering into with the creditors. In this regard, it's important to have a strengthened parliament so that it scrutinizes these agreements and makes sure that the public is aware. And we also need an active citizen, CSO, to continuously exert pressure to governments to disclose these public debt laws. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ranga. Thank you very much to our stellar panel. We really appreciate your inputs. Thank you very much to the audience. You've been really a great audience. I will call upon Shem Joshua. Shem is our policy analyst under the debt portfolio. He'll give the vote of thanks. Shem, please. But thank you very much for your participation, and I've been Samantha, your moderator. Shem, please.
Let me take this opportunity to say thank you to everyone, also to our panelists, Samantha. I think one thing that I would want to say is that public debts must always be public. And through this discussion we've had today, you can see how different countries, sometimes you'll find a clause saying that we are not supposed to put it public. And you wonder how that debt is a public property. So I think from today, we can see and we can live here knowing very well that we have obligation to know exactly what's happening in terms of the contractuals that the government have on our behalf. So I want to say thank you to all panelists, to the audience. This was a very good opportunity and we have learned a lot. And maybe just to clap for ourselves. I think it was not easy sitting here and listening. Thank you so much and God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you very much, Dr. Magali.